To this day, I have no idea what it is that I saw out there in the woods. I can provide you with any number of descriptions and accounts, but there's only one thing that really matters. Whatever it was, or maybe still is, out in those woods, most assuredly wanted to be seen by me. The closest town to the area where I saw whatever it was sits a few miles away, but the place that it occurred is very remote. So remote, in fact, that it seems unlikely, or even entirely impossible, that anybody else has ever stumbled upon the creature's den, since this was roughly 20 years ago. This setting is one of those lost frontier kinds of places, where local kids go to do drugs and have sex. We were too far out from town for anybody to hear us. The woods were vast, large trees, steep ravines all around us. The time was just after midnight, 1991. So excuse me, I guess 30 years now. Wow, it's been that long. Anyway, at the time, I and my friends had all been drinking hard liquor since dinner the night before. In preparation for trick-or-treating, of course. I had just turned 18 and went through a heavy stint of alcoholism. But besides that, it was now late fall, and the night was getting very chilly. We were riding around in the pickup truck. Yes, we were intoxicated. The windows were rolled halfway down, partially to keep us warm when we drove, but the cold, fresh air of the night also felt good. I had been drinking hard liquor on an empty stomach all day. I was drunk, but not piss-drunk, still enough to be coherent. The next thing I remember is looking down at my hands and having these vivid, horrible hallucinations of my entire hands just being covered in blood. And the night around us seemed to be getting darker, like a storm was coming, but not a storm that you would think. I blinked hard, trying to clear my eyes. Trust me, these weren't beer goggles. I looked into the woods where I'd seen something move off in the distance, just behind us. But maybe it was the tricks of my eyes because it wasn't there anymore. What came next, however, will stay with me forever. Check this out. I was looking directly into the woods, then looked over my shoulder at my friends in the truck, and this ripple of darkness, I would call it, like a wave rolling through the forest, passed right past us down the hill from where we had just come. It kind of went left to right, then ended and disappeared from sight on the right side of us as quickly as it had come. I've never been a fan of horror movies or scary stories in general. I don't like being scared by things that really exist in real life. Things that I can imagine happening to me. It goes against my nature. I don't like it. This is what scares me the most. The knowledge that all of us are vulnerable. No matter how brave or self-confident somebody might believe themselves to be. Anything can happen to anyone at any time. And if you think you're ready for when it does, there's a pretty good chance you're about to get the living hell scared out of you. The woods, they were so dark and foreboding, and then much darker than they should have been. Something had changed, as if whatever was out there was closer now than before, and this time, I knew we couldn't escape it. I took another look in the direction that I'd seen whatever it was disappear off in. It wasn't there anymore, but at least this time, I saw what had caused the ripple of darkness through the trees. A shadow had passed over a large tree behind us and began moving forward, coming towards us up the hill. The three of us were sitting in silence as the three dark, large figures came closer, merging into one, closer to the road where we parked. I just remember this powerful, overwhelming sense of fear, as if something was pulling me toward the darkened woods. The darkness felt like it was calling my name, wanting me to come to it. Whatever I had seen out there on the edge of the woods, it wanted me. It wanted something from me, and that's when I knew. Whatever it was out there in the dark, whatever it had been that had made that dark ripple through the forest. I was dealing with something that clearly was not human. This being came closer to us, and then stopped just at the edge of our headlights' light, and looked up at us. It was then that we got a look at whatever this being was. Its eyes were yellow, bloodshot. Its facial expression was twisted into something horrible I can't even begin to describe. It almost looked like the face of an evil being, except more feral and wild-looking, kind of like a wild beast's skull underneath its skin, instead of a normal human face. I remember beginning to cry, saying, "Oh God, no," out loud. I incoherently shook and cried. The thing that had been stalking us turned around and walked just out of the light. I knew it was keeping an eye on us. Nothing will sober you up quicker than coming into contact with entities from other dimensions, or so I believe this was. When this thing had gone out from the light, I grabbed my pistol from under my seat and checking it. It was already loaded with hollow point rounds, and I made sure they were seated properly in the chamber. Out here, in case of wild animals, you always want to have a weapon. You can never be too safe. We all sat there silently for a moment. Then, one of my friends made the comment, "Who would ever believe us? I mean, we can't tell the police about this. They think we're crazy. Plus, we reek like alcohol." So, we figured it was in our best interest if we headed back into town, where we'd be safe. Just sort of let the alcohol drain out of our systems. So we started the truck, turned it around, looking back at where we had been. I could see that whatever had been out there was now hiding in the shadows, underneath the trees, still watching us. I felt it. I can tell it was there. A small part of my inner being understood what I was seeing, but another part of me didn't want to believe that anything this horrible even existed. There was something in the darkness that night, and it was not going to let us go until it got what it came for. Something from one of us, possibly all three of us. I figured we'd be safe once we made it back into town, though nobody could hurt you there. There were too many people around. That's what I believed. As we drove back into town, suddenly feeling more sober than ever after everything that had happened, was accompanied by a worse feeling, being followed. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror at whatever it was that was following us, and that's when I could see it again. It was moving behind us to the trees, this massive, horrible silhouette. It was trailing us, moving from tree to tree. I kept driving faster and faster along the dark road. My friends and I were panicking, trying to make the truck drive faster, but this truck was a beat-up old podunk piece of crap. It could only go so fast. We were all screaming to go faster, and we tried pushing this truck as hard as it could go. It was going now about 60 miles an hour. It couldn't go much more than that. Whatever it was behind us did not seem to be faltering, but finally, it kind of just vanished after pursuing us for an unknown period of time. We were successful in making it out to that portion of the woods and, in no time, back into town. Now, it was probably about 1 a.m, I believe. We had been drinking, so we didn't want to report what we had seen or experienced to anybody. But let's be honest here. There is no amount of alcohol that will allow you to experience what we did. Even today, I'm still friends with those same guys that I experienced this with. All of our stories remain the same, no details having been changed. We all saw the same entity. One thing I wanted to quickly mention about this is that there was just this evil aura that emanated from it. You could feel it. You could feel that it wanted to harm us and do bad. It's kind of like this. You know how you can just sense people's auras, right? You can feel certain things from people. You don't exactly have to be empathetic. It's just our natural human discernment. That's what we all felt off this being. Afterwards, we all felt really weird for a while. I know my one friend who was with us got horribly ill for the next few days. And no, not like alcohol. I'm talking about fever, but popped right back normal after a little bit. And the next few days, we'd all felt drained. And again, not in a hungover way, but in a way like we had just ran 20 miles. It was much different than an alcohol hangover. It was something, I don't know. Anyway, I'm sorry for the long story, but it's important that I share every aspect of what happened on that night back in 1991. The forest behind my house is so scary. I have always heard stories about a Wendigo living there, and it's given me the chills. Once, when I was 8 years old, we were hiking through that part of the woods and saw something huge in the distance. It looked kind of like a Bigfoot, but more human-like, with glowing yellow eyes. My father told us to stay out of the back area of the woods. We had no idea what we were playing around with, and we needed to be very careful. He explained to us that there were bad spirits back there. My dad, who supposedly knew a lot of history around here, supposedly there's this old Indian burial ground nearby, but I've heard that old tripe before. I don't know if you can trust that. Once, my grandma was in the hospital, and I had to go spend some time with her. She's always been a little different, and she told me about this weird creature, I guess, that natives used to worship back when they were still acceptably civilized people. And I say that respectfully. Our government has taken so much from them. Whatever civilization they had has been stripped by them and stripped from them. When they were united, a civilized tribe, there were a lot of things that were different, but anyway, she claimed that this was a spirit of nature or something. She said, if somebody destroys the land too much, then they will upset the balance of nature. It'll make this being take forms of different things and take revenge on whoever did it. Well, my grandmother died shortly after we got home from visiting her. I believe one of the spirits possessed her and killed her. My father claims that because we went back there, we had been targeted, and this Wendigo spirit attached itself to me and then attached itself to my grandmother, killing her. It's just speculation, but what do you think about this? I don't know what this was. A skinwalker, a Wendigo. I think I saw something. I know it sounds crazy, but this was something in the woods. Now, there's a big forest at the back of my neighborhood, right? And as I was driving home from work last night, I looked over and saw something running quickly across the field. I thought it might be an animal, but then I saw its face. It looked just like the Wendigo paintings I've seen. The eyes were all red, and it had a jaw that kind of hinged open, exposing yellow teeth jutting out. Now, completely panicked and terrified, I immediately drove home, locking every door in my house. I don't know if that thing was a skinwalker or a Wendigo, but probably not. It can't hurt to be careful, just in case. I mean, I'll say it again. I don't know what it is that I saw, but I can tell you this. It's something I don't ever want to see again. Last time I was up on the mountain, I saw something. Something that made me think the stories about Wendigos in these woods were true. I mean, I never used to believe in them, but now, well, I'm not so sure. It began as just a normal hike. Nothing different about this one from all the others before it. My friends Mark and Ian had both decided to come with me today, and were heading out early in the morning because we wanted to catch some good footage for a documentary. We called it The Mythical Creatures of Appalachia. Of course, it was more of a joke than anything. We weren't really capturing anything, if at all. As much as I'd like to believe we got footage, well, we didn't film anything. Anyway, we spent a lot of time at the summit, and felt like somebody was following us from behind. At first, we ignored it, but the feeling just grew too strong. When we would turn around, Of course, how cliche, there wouldn't be anybody else there. We tried to keep all of our thoughts on the Wendigo so that it would stay away. Jokingly, of course, because at this point, we didn't believe. We just thought maybe we were being paranoid being out in the wild. Let's just say what happened caused us to cut our hiking trip in the mountains short. We wanted to get back into town and out of the woods, so we began walking as fast as we could. We kept looking behind us, thinking maybe we were being followed by someone, right? Not quite something yet. We got more and more paranoid as time went on, but there was never anything there, just trees. It made me feel like I was going crazy, and it really messed with my head. We were almost ready to give up when a small patch of tall grass that had been swaying in the wind suddenly stopped moving. My friends and I froze right where we stood, afraid to move another inch for fear of whatever could be in those bushes, seeing or hearing us come closer. The three of us turned around slowly with our lights, pointed towards the spot where the movement had ceased. That's when I saw it. I just froze there, like my friends and I did. And when I say a pair of glowing red eyes staring right through those bushes, it was hard to see for sure, but I could tell this thing had long, stringy black hair. From behind me, Mark was like, "Do you guys see that?" And we all nodded, without taking our eyes off what we were looking at. We were in total disbelief. "What do you think it is?" Ian answered by saying, "It's more likely some kind of coyote with rabies or something," shakily. He sounded so unsure of himself, desperate for an answer. And all of a sudden, that patch of grass began moving again. We couldn't move if we wanted to. We were just standing there in shock as this figure slowly, fully came out into view from behind the tall blades of grass into our sight. I don't think any of us could have blinked at that moment, for fear of not being able to run or see this thing up close. And believe me, none of us didn't want to miss this. As soon as it stepped all the way through the thick bush line, it stopped dead still onto its hind legs and let out this sound. It was like a combination between a man's voice mixed with a high-pitched dog's yelp and a scream. It shook those long, stringy black hairs from side to side and let out another ear-piercing screech. We couldn't help but move backwards a few steps, but we stopped when none of us wanted to turn our backs on this thing yet. This thing was standing right in front of us. I mean, it was practically right there. If we wanted to reach out and touch it, we probably could have. I can't really explain how it looked, except to say it resembled some sort of dark figure. It was gross looking. There were parts of its face and arms exposed, but I guess the best way I could summarize what we were seeing. Think of an upright coyote, or something with bad, nasty mange, mixed with a feral human being. That description doesn't do it justice, but it gets you in the right frame of thinking. Completely shocked at what we were seeing, I think all of us three reacted out of fear and took off running away from whatever this thing was. I don't think any of us knew at the time, but Ian tripped, and we didn't immediately notice. He fell to the ground. I stopped. I turned around, and now my mind is filled with fear as I run back towards my friend to grab him. When I turned around to look at this thing again, it was now coming after both of us, picking up speed. The look on its face seemed frenzied, like it was out for blood. It looked down at Ian on the ground and let out another screech, this one sounding like a mixture of laughter and pain put together. As I tried lifting Ian up, something caught my eye again behind this creature, making its way out of the forest. What appeared to be 5 other figures emerging from somewhere back in the bushes. They looked almost just like the one coming right after us. They all began coming right out of the bush, moving, mobilizing. I yanked Ian up and caught with Mark, who was already ahead of us. Now, in that instance, the thing directly following us dove into the forest on our left, keeping parallel the entire time. It didn't seem right, so I stopped running and turned around. Just in time, I see it pounce on top of this deer that had emerged from the forest without us knowing about it. The deer lets out this high-wailed scream, and it sounded like the creature's, as if this thing was playing with its food. I don't think any of us realized till later, but we kept moving fast, trying not to turn our backs on this thing and those 5 other things. We were moving faster for some reason, desperate to make sure none of them got too close. Well, after what seemed like forever, we stopped for a second, looked back at where we came from. Nothing. I feel terrible for saying this, but thank God for that deer. I think that deer acted as a distraction, and these things took their attention on it instead of us. We were safely able to make it back and cut our trip short, like I said. I have never in all my years came across anything remotely similar to the strange creature we all 3 saw that day. I firmly believe it was a Wendigo. I can't be too sure though. It looks like a large man covered with thick fur from head to toe, part animal, with a face that is not really recognizable, but unique, and these horrible bulging eyes. Again, this thing was grotesque. Even now, when I try remembering the experience we had, my body still shivers thinking about what we saw in that dark part of the forest, deep on the mountainside. This is one of those moments where you can say, I never believed in a Wendigo until now. I don't know if any of us will ever go back there again. I mean, who would want to? You can call me Frank. See, I'm a paranormal researcher up here in Toronto. Now, I've been wanting to write to you for some time about the strange things and sightings that have been happening up here in my beautiful home country. Something eerie is happening in the forests of Canada. A hideous creature that can be best described as a malevolent monster, equipped with supernatural abilities. Yes, this thing has been sighted. It is known to the natives by their name, the Wendigo. To say it resembles an ape-like creature would not be correct. It stands erect like a human being, but does not walk on all 4s. One Canadian province alone had more than 60 sightings reported over a span of 8 years, 1990 to 1998. And this number only represents those people who were even brave enough to talk about what they saw in writing, risking careers, reputations, everything on the line, for the sake of perseverance in science and cryptozoology. Brave souls they be. Some eyewitness claims that the Wendigo possesses enough power that could rival those of, say shape-shifting aliens, or even vampires, or witches. This includes mind control. According to Native American folklore, this creature is said to have a magnetic personality, similar to the dark spirits or aliens that are also believed to be around, and they use humans for sustenance, such as luring them into tight grips, either through means of hypnosis or just plain force. On rare occasions, when the Wendigos were encountered in rural areas, it was known for them to take small children who were left unattended, even for short periods of time. And in some cases, they appeared out of nowhere, snatching children because their parents were not paying any attention. Now, the majority of these child-snatching cases took place on sunny summer days, when the kids would do something like leave their homes unsupervised, all while the mothers would tend to household chores, or maybe be busy cooking in the kitchen. One story in particular involved a stolen child. A woman who lived alone in the forest, far away from neighbors, called the police. She claimed her 5-year-old boy was missing. When they arrived, she claimed she had just checked on him a few minutes ago, and now he was gone. They should hurry because it was getting dark, and there are wild animals out here. When authorities actually arrived at the scene, she told them and explained She was making him lunch, and he said he had to use the bathroom and ran outside to pee, like most little boys do. She immediately went looking for him when she couldn't find him anywhere around their house. The police searched with flashlights, thinking maybe he fell into a river. But after their extensive search, turning up with 0 results, they're not sure. They begin to get skeptical. The woman or mom's peculiar attitude was suspicious. If anything did happen as she had claimed, it would have happened a long time ago. The forest is very thick and visibility is poor at night. The local police was about to call in the government investigations when one of them noticed freshly made what appeared to be monkey tracks near a hollow hole that was close by. Although he had no idea what type of animal could leave those marks on the ground, since it was only end of March, he felt 100% sure that whatever made them was not human. Unless the kid suddenly grew feet, which became separated from his body. I mean, who knows? Maybe that's how the mother and the boy went missing at the same time. Because, by the way, it turns out the mother did go missing after this. But anyway, before they could investigate deeper, their radio got a call from nearby, saying that another child was snatched by what they had described as being big and hairy, and later on, the description a giant troll was given. The kid's parents were watching TV apparently while he played outside. I guess when he came running back to the house, asking for some water, he wasn't there anymore. Instead, this grotesque-looking creature grabbed him. Another witness who lived next to a wooded area also claimed she saw this tall creature. Also, she kind of described it as a troll-looking thing would run across one side of her lawn one night, then disappear into the trees on the other side. She claimed it looked gross. It wasn't a bear. She didn't tell anybody about what she saw. She was afraid somebody would call her crazy after admitting to seeing this creature. She also described it as exactly as foretold in fairy tales. Another local woman called in saying that the dog began barking like crazy during the night shift. It saw something moving around outside of its window, causing the dog to get curious and to look out. Now, she too claims to have seen a tall hairy monster running across the road while carrying a dead carcass. Not of a human, I'm talking like a deer. It's pretty evident that something is going on up here in Canada, and none of these sightings are Bigfoots. While I know we have our fair share of cryptids, just like the United States does, I believe much of this work is of a Wendigo demon, not that of a Sasquatch in my opinion. As a cryptozoologist and a paranormal researcher, it is my duty to pursue these creatures further and seek out the answers we're all looking for better or for worse. I hope we connect, and I hope you and your audience can help me and share information that anybody knows. Thanks. I had an experience up in the northern woods that you probably wouldn't believe. I was going camping with a close friend of mine up by the Three Sisters Falls. It was getting dark when we arrived, so we set up our camp, made some supper, and got out our sleeping bags. I should have known something was wrong when there were no animals around to be seen or heard that night. The only noise was from the river, and it was beginning to get cold outside. As I fell asleep, I began having these nightmares about seeing an ancient creature in the woods that would come towards me, sometimes hiding its face and then showing it, but not doing anything except walking right past me, as if nothing happened. I woke up in my sleeping bag soaked through with sweat. My entire being, my heart, feeling like it could burst out of my chest at any moment. I believed what I had just seen in my dreams was a Wendigo, or something similar. I told my friend, and he didn't really believe me. He said that we had never heard of such things being sighted around here. It was probably just some strange nightmares. Now, after both of us falling back asleep, I began seeing this creature almost every time I closed my eyes, and eventually, I dreamt more about how it looked. Pale with this nasty hair all over its body, except for where the face is. Bright yellowish green eyes, sharp teeth on a twisted mouth. It smiled at me each time until finally the day came. I don't know how to describe it honestly, but this horrible feeling just lingered all morning long. My friend, he could feel it too. Described his own vivid nightmares he had all night, which we shared and were very similar to our own. We made sure the tents were tightly shut up and began packing our gear. As we were packing, the feeling of something lingering, something watching, never left. It was silent at first, but eventually grew more and more in intensity. The entire time we were packing up, the feeling that we weren't alone never stopped. And as soon as we had finished packing up, put the tents back in their bags, my friend had this really bad headache. He was telling me he couldn't take it anymore. We left and couldn't deal with it. I wish I knew what sort of strange paranormal events we had dealt with that very evening and night. I'm not sure if it was demonic, or if this really was the case of a Wendigo. This is exactly why I'm reaching out to you, in hopes you could provide us with some answers of some kind. See, my knowledge of cryptozoology is so limited, but from the little I know, this makes the most sense of what it could be. But, like I said before, I'll let you be the judge. I was out camping in the woods for a few days at the time with my friend and cousin. We were sitting by this lake, right around midnight, and we heard branches snapping, footsteps headed towards us, and this weird guttural growl. It sounded like a cross between a wolf and a bear, or something. Anyway, my friend said he'd go take a look. I told him not to, but trying to be the hero, he did anyway. He was gone for like 20 minutes, and I hear branches and twigs snapping. He comes running back, freaked out, and just with this panicked expression all over his face. "We need to go now," was all he said as he grabbed our gear and we ran off. Of course, we came back. Later that night, we're all in the tent, and we hear branches snapping and footsteps again. In that moment, I'm wondering to myself, why did we come back? Why didn't we just leave like he had told us? So, I am done. I unzip the tent and yell out. There's no response. We just keep hearing these strange sounds for the next half hour. We heard this strange voice calling to all of our names. We thought it was maybe somebody playing a prank, but that was quickly dismissed after the voice became very audible and sounded all sorts of wrong. It was distorted and crackly, like it was coming from an old FM radio or something. I looked out of my tent, but I didn't see anybody. I tried my best to ignore it. We were all pretty spooked by what we were hearing. It wasn't until later, though, that next day, when I was taking a piss out in the woods, I noticed a lot of blood on the ground around me. As far as I knew, I hadn't seen any birds or animals around, so I wasn't sure what to make of it, other than maybe some poor animal got eaten. So I zipped up, went back to hanging out with my friend and cousin, and we began hearing the sounds again. A low growl, followed by this strange humming noise. Listen, I can't begin to tell you just how terrified we all were by sensing this creature, whatever it was. We all booked it out of our camping spot. Enough was enough. We both all ran towards where our truck had been parked, and without wasting a second, we all jumped in and flew out there very fast. We would come back and collect our stuff in a couple of days, but nothing, and I mean nothing, could prepare us for what sort of dark, sickly-looking creature we saw. It was ugly. I mean, it kind of looked like a golem troll-looking thing. I don't know. It freaked all of us out badly. I don't even like to talk about it, to be honest. It brings back bad memories. Even writing this out was tough. I've heard lots of stories about Wendigos, but they sound like a mix of Native American folklore and tall tales. I believe the Wendigo creature is part native culture from the north-central North America, namely in the Midwestern United States and eastern Canada. My only Wendigo story would be that my grandmother told me one of those scary campfire stories back when I was much younger, which involved a group of kids wandering off into the woods and being killed by this creature, aka Wendigo. It sounds like this thing is supposed to take on the form of other things in order to lure people away from the safety that they're in into the woods. But again, I've never seen it. Wendigo sightings aren't just restricted to places like Canada and the Great Lakes, though. I guess they've been reported as far away from there as Florida, even California, where certain Native American folklore likely wouldn't reach or influence people so much. At least that kind of folklore. I think that's odd and make these sightings seem much more credible. Anyway, as the story goes, a Wendigo is basically a man or a woman that has been, possessed by an evil spirit and turned into some sort of ogre demon thing. This creature's skin begins to change into something much different. The Wendigo is said to have a tall, lanky body, long arms, and it's often described as being very gaunt, bony knees and elbows. This creature usually has no hair, only sparse clumps of grayish hair on its head, and it looks disgusting, and looks like some sort of cross between an emaciated imp or something. And Wendigo sightings also seem to be increasing. In fact, I remember hearing news reports in the spring of 2005 about people in Florida seeing this strange creature, which was described as walking upright like a man, yet being 8 feet tall with extra long arms. One long arm longer than the other. It was also described as having a deathly pale white face, stringy black hair, and a large mouth that contained many fangs. Sometimes, the Wendigo is said to have glowing red eyes, or even blue ones. I know this isn't really a story and more just information, but I'd be curious to look more into the research side of things. What are your thoughts on Wendigos? I would love to know. Wendigos are these tall, skinny monsters that kind of look like a man, and I guess they're supposed to have antlers. They often have clawed hands and, as far as I know, walk on 2 legs. Some Wendigo sightings were in the woods or forests, while others were much deeper in the woods, so thick there's no sunlight. They cannot be easily seen. In fact, if you didn't know, in the Wendigo myth, there are said to be people of Native American descent who had committed cannibalism. They were not accepted by other tribe members. They would eat their companions, and eventually an entire village's population was gone, except for one person. That person was banished from his tribe and wandered through the forest, forever as a Wendigo. The Wendigo is often seen in the Algonquin forest of northeastern America. It is an extremely violent creature, said to attack and eat people, hence the cannibalism. But it's not savage like a monster. The way it attacks is very cautious, premeditated, smart, unlike other monsters that are just mindless killing machines. They can travel anywhere, from running on all fours to walking bipedally. Wendigos may be changed by the moon and can change from wolf-like creatures into these man-eating beasts, sometimes at night. The Wendigo monster is often supposed to be attributed with creating winter storms and freezing temperatures as it passes through an area. It's even said that in one Native American tribe's story, there were a group of hunters that went hunting for the Wendigo. When they found it, It tried to escape by turning into a wolf, like shapeshifting. Although they killed the wolf, the Wendigo still came back as another animal, such as an eagle or even a human being. The Wendigo is said to prefer cold climates or places where there are blizzards and heavy snow. The lore goes that anybody who comes too close to the Wendigo will be killed by it and eaten. Native tribes also say that they sometimes return from their death in spirit form, or become another monster after death as a form of vengeance. It might not have just been one person who committed the cannibalism. It might actually be a group of them trying to gain their revenge by killing more people. When you hear the howling wind or heavy snow, it is said that the Wendigo can either be nearby or have just gone through the area. They usually like to stay in heavily wooded areas close to wilderness, where they are much harder to find, and they can use snow to their advantage. You won't be able to see them or hear them most of the time, but you may know when one is near if you see a snowy area where there normally wouldn't be any. Bottom line, if you're near a Wendigo, it might try to disguise itself as another person with its dark magic. Beware for those who don't know. I was a park ranger for over 20 years. It never ceased to amaze me just how many people would tell me about my encounters they had with the paranormal, all while camping or hiking in our very public lands. Since I've retired, I've also heard from friends and acquaintances alike that are park rangers all across the country. Stories of bizarre creatures that were disturbing and equally distressing to see. I suppose I was always logical and even scientifically minded through these perhaps crazy sightings, but you never know. Many of these people that have seen these things were always dubbed insane, lunatics, or even as they say today, imbalanced. But there's always one story that has stuck with me, because somebody died. A father and his daughter were out for a walk in the woods. Now, where they're walking is a little pond where ducks will congregate, and this local man decided to take his 5-year-old daughter down to see the pond and the ducks. The man later explained to me that as he was feeding the ducks with his daughter, he heard yelling in the trees, another person, screaming as if they were being attacked. He looked around frantically, trying to identify who or what it was that was causing all the commotion. He told me that he decided to run into the trees, following the sound, and he came across a dead body. A man who had been savagely killed was covered in blood. It was a terrible sight, and he told me he is so glad he didn't bring his daughter in with him. She stood beside the pond, forbidden to walk anywhere. The man said the killer was nowhere to be found, as he was looking for a human. But he did see some wolf-like creatures on the fringes of the woods, looking at him from the trees with red eyes. He left the dead man, went and got his daughter, and ran to safety. He was deeply distressed and agitated when he told me the story. I never forgot that story. It stayed with me all these years later, because it was real, and somebody actually died. Somebody that lost their lives at the hands of something deep in the woods. Something unknown but dangerous and violent. I've been a ranger for many years now. I've had countless encounters with the paranormal and strange creatures of all kinds while doing my daily rounds. As for this job, it's pretty normal to experience unexplainable things from time to time, though most people would normally just shrug off those events as being their imagination or overreactive nerves. One particular time, we had a report that there was a fire in the woods and smoke was seen rising. We took a walk out, myself and my colleague, expecting to come across some college kids or high school kids who, of course, had been drinking. Maybe just started a fire as a prank. When we walked out, we realized we couldn't even smell smoke, which was odd. We also didn't hear any of the usual sounds that kids would make. No loud noises, no screams or laughing. Just pure silence, deep in the woods. It was incredibly unnerving. We kept walking nonetheless, and had the exact same spot on the map. When we got there, it was just a small grassy area that had the markings of a tent, but no such tent was there. It was empty. Smoke and fire surrounded by looming dark trees. My colleague was a great hulking man, and so even I was taken aback when he screamed. He grabs onto my shoulder like a baby, almost pulling me to the ground. He kept pointing into the woods, and when I turned to see, I nearly died. It seemed to be some sort of apparition, in the shape of a human, but white, pure white, like white skin. No discernible features like a face or hair or nose or ears. Just a blank face with green like slits for eyes. It also had white skin from head to toe and was white as a sheet. This apparition stood staring at us for what felt like an eternity. Although it was probably only like 10 or 20 seconds. It eventually seemed to disappear, not even walk away or fade, but just disappear in a flash. We eventually recovered and got out to feet. And boy, if anyone had seen us, two grown tough men in our ranger uniforms, on the floor sobbing like women. But we both felt like we had seen something beyond this world. Beyond any world. Almost an extraterrestrial. To this day, I have no idea what it was that I saw. But thankfully, never saw it again. My colleague retired after the incident and never kept in contact. I think he was so highly distressed at what had happened, he couldn't cope with being anywhere near the forest. I hope one day I find answers as to what this creature was. It would give me a definitive peace of mind. I'm a new park ranger here at Silver Lake State Park, right in the middle of Tennessee. I've been here for 2 weeks, and I love it. This is the first time in my life that I have lived someplace other than New York City. It's beautiful here, with all of its hills and mountains, trees and nature surrounding. I feel so blessed to have this job, wake up to this explosion of nature. However, there have been 1 or 2 incidents in this job I can't quite explain. One day, I was in my cabin, doing a quick check of the surrounding areas on my binoculars, and I was going from right to left to right, scanning for anything unusual. I stopped when I saw something large and brown in the distance. It looked completely bizarre. It was roughly around 6 to 8 feet tall, in the shape and form of a man, but completely covered in brown hair, with little patches of white. It seemed to be a man dressed like a dog, but this couldn't be. The face was completely dog-like, and it had the face of a wolf. I felt sick to my stomach, wondering, had somebody drugged me? Or maybe I was sleep-deprived. I watched this thing from my binoculars when it looked up, staring right at me, cold in the eye. Immediately, I fell back off my chair onto the floor, spilling my coffee everywhere. The next thing, my manager came in, asked had I been drinking. Now, I debated internally about whether I should tell him or not, but I decided to reveal all. When I told him, he simply just rubbed his chin, looked serious. He walked to the window and looked out into the vast expanse of forest and land. There's something out there, That scares me. What it is, I don't have a clue. I didn't know exactly what he meant, but I took it to mean he has encountered this thing before, or at least heard reports of its existence. I wasn't completely crazy. I'm pretty sure that I've seen this creature a few weeks ago, but it disappeared quickly, as if to escape from my stare. Look, it has yet to take away the love for this job. If anything, I would like to know more what's out there, and if it wants to be discovered. I mean, sure, when rangers discovered bears for the first time, there was fear. Maybe I have discovered some new species, but a part of me feels I've encountered something terrible, something dark that has power to do terrible things. Skinwalkers are shapeshifters. They can turn into any animal that they want to, which is why it is so hard to believe in them. The main idea of this creature is to be they feared for what they may or may not do. Little is known about these creatures, but many stories are told around the Southwest states. One particular incident was told to me by my own great-grandmother. It was in fact an experience she had when she was 11 or 12. This would have been in the early 1930s. She said that she was in the Great Depression, as you would imagine, very depressing. She was helping her father on the farm, lifting bales of hay, helping to feed the cattle. She said that her feet had blisters, and her hands had sores from all the physical labor. If only kids today knew. She told me that it was around 4 p.m. in the summer. Her father was back inside, getting ready for dinner. She was still outside. She told me that she was pretty pissed off that all her brothers had gone back in. That's when she explained that something strange happened. The sun began getting really small in the sky, and bigger, and eventually disappearing behind the clouds. This left the sky very gray, and she began to fear for herself. The next thing she told me, that one of the cattle beside her began going crazy, running around and roaring, greatly agitated. It scared the heck out of her, she told me. She had no experience in calming animals, and the next thing, she said the cow ran behind some bush, then emerged as a sheep, but covered in blood, and with the face of a wolf. My great-grandmother told me she stood there, absolutely petrified, watching this sheep emerge. But not a sheep. Something else. Something dark and demonic. I remember. She broke down as she explained her story. My great-grandmother, the 90, were living such a trauma from many years before. It was deeply emotive and moving. It showed me that my trauma and pain never leaves memory. She explained that the sheep continued running around the field, scarring the cattle, maiming several of them. It looked totally crazed and bloodthirsty, and the next thing she told me was that her own father came out with the family shotgun and attempted to shoot the sheep, but it disappeared behind the bushes, never coming out. When they checked the bushes, nothing was there except some dried blood and wool. My great-grandmother said her own father moved the entire family after the incident, and, of course, regularly used blessed salt and holy water all over the farm. My great-grandmother was very into supernatural and paranormal events. She did a great deal of research on the incident, and is very convinced she saw a shapeshifter. I mean, it would make a lot of sense, as many of the characteristics of shapeshifters are fulfilled in my great-grandmother's description of the beast. I'm just sorry she is gone now. To have lived with such a traumatic memory, it must have been tough. This story, of course, has completely fascinated me, from a child to the age of 35, today. I feel compelled to put pen to paper, so they say, and share this recollection of my great-grandmother's tale with as many as possible. I mean, I feel I owe it to her. No child deserved to see such horror that is what my great-grandmother saw. So, if you are reading this, please tell me something about them. Have they always existed? How do we get rid of them? What do they do? What are they capable of? Are they all evil? I mean, are there good shapeshifters? I have so many questions, but I am committed to researching this, and hope you will bring me many answers, if not for me, for my great-grandmother. Thank you for reading. I work as a ranger here in the state park in the beautiful place of Utah. Now, after 2 full seasons of working there, I happen to get my own patrol vehicle. So, I decided to cruise around and check out areas that got to little traffic. One such area was an old rock quarry off the main highway. The road leading up there had fallen into disrepair only 5 or 6 years ago. It wasn't impossible to drive on, just not advisable. The funds are limited, so measures to prevent people from taking the road were limited. Even so, most people had enough sense to stay away. Once in a great while, we encountered urban explorers and daredevils, people that were just looking for something to fill their content on YouTube with. But, for the most part, the road stayed empty. I've only heard one story about anyone ever trying to go inside the actual rock quarry. That supposedly took place a long time ago. It stuck in my mind, and there seemed to be this unwritten rule that the area was to be avoided. I wondered at that. If I had been a young kid again, with no responsibilities, I would have been exploring this area as much as possible, heedless of the isolation or any real dangers. Days of patrolling the ruined roads turned into weeks, which turned into months. Before long, thanks to me, the road was halfway drivable. I would get out, remove fallen branches, move rocks that were big enough to be a hazard, and yet small enough for me to move. It still wasn't ideal for a vehicle, but somebody with a bicycle would do just fine. Nothing ever really happened on my patrols, so without really thinking about it, I got soft. I got used to taking my time, often getting out of my patrol vehicle to take in the scenery around me, especially at the abandoned rock quarry. A large section of it had permanently pooled with water. It was like having my own personal lake to look at. After months of nothing, the events of my story took me by surprise. I drove along the abandoned road as usual, except that day, there was a coyote walking alongside the road. Seeing this animal made me smile. I thought that he would eventually break off and pick a different path, but he kept pace with me, right alongside the road. Surely he wasn't waiting for me to get out of my car. There were easier ways to bag a meal in the park. When I drove along, he moved along with me. When I stopped the patrol car, he stopped. Stranger yet, the animal seemed like he couldn't take his eyes off of me. I reached into the shallow depths of my knowledge of coyotes and their behavior. I couldn't think of anything that would explain why this particular coyote would want to tag me. I was armed, and I considered getting out of the vehicle to see if there's a strange chance that the animal was tame. I decided against it. If the animal were rabid or something, self-defense wouldn't make much of a difference if he bit me, at least once. He followed me all the way out to the rock quarry. That's when the coyote began to move down towards the water. Now this got my curiosity up. I wondered if there was any fish or anything that had taken up residence in the water that Mr. Coyote can prey on. The land down to the rock quarry had dropped at a very steep angle, so I couldn't see him. I got out of the patrol vehicle. I found that I couldn't see him anywhere at all. There are no ripples in the water, so it wasn't likely that he had dove in. I went the rest of the patrol without seeing the coyote, and I wondered what happened to him, but I didn't dwell on it too long. The next patrol, there was a young buck with a very impressive set of antlers. He saw me and began following the vehicle. It was a real treat to see a deer that up close, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about the animal. Not only was it following me, but there was something about the way it was looking at me out of its eyes. It reminded me too much of the coyote that I had encountered just several days prior. The more I tried not to think about it, the more that look in its eyes stuck forever in my mind. When I came to the rock quarry, the buck ambled down the steep slope towards the water. I got out of the patrol car to see if it was going to get a drink of water or something. When I had a clear view, the buck was nowhere to be found. It had vanished, and part of me had expected as much. I couldn't explain to you at the time why this whole thing made me feel so uneasy. Nothing had happened to me, but it was like two magnets had been placed very close to each other in my mind, so I could feel the tension between them. They weren't close enough to connect, though. A few days later, while patrolling that lonely road, I saw the coyote again. It looked at me the same way as it had before, which only reinforced how much it had the same expression as the deer. I tried cruising along at a faster pace, and the coyote did everything it could to keep up with me. Again, we came to the water, and it disappeared down the slope. I moved faster this time to see where it would go. When I had a clear view, I didn't see the coyote anymore, but instead a woman. Her hair was long and jet black, and her skin was the color and texture of tanned hide. She wore more modern and rugged clothing, but she also seemed to have several animal pelts tied all around her. She turned to look at me, and there was something about her eyes. It felt like a wrecking ball had hit me. Right before my eyes, she jumped into the water, and in the space between her feet leaving the ground and her body hitting the water, she had become something scaly with a tail. I saw the long snout of an alligator breach the water before disappearing under the surface. I couldn't believe my eyes. I became a very paranoid man after that. I ran into coyotes that wouldn't follow me, and I spotted deer that ran away from me. But the simple act of seeing each of them was a miniature heart attack. One time, when a coyote seemed to lock eyes with me, just for a little too long, I reached for my side, like I was going to shoot it, and that was more than enough to scare it off. Another time, on the lonely road, I was sure that I had seen the outline of a stately buck trailing me from a distance. It was when I braked that it stood for a moment before finally running off. I had no more direct encounters like I had before. Now, I have shared this story several times. Most of the people I tell this to tell me that I need mental help. One person, and only one, told me that I had been stalked by what they called a skinwalker, and that they had been attempting to give me the evil eye, perhaps achieving partial success with the state of fear, and I seem to find myself in this every time I'm on patrol. I'm not sure what to think. Maybe if you read this to your listeners, maybe they'll know. Anything, answers and all, are greatly appreciated. Thank you for everything you do and all the stories you read. You really don't know how much you are helping people like me and many others out there deal with this newfound reality. You have to be careful of creatures while out near the Navajo reservation at nighttime. If you're not careful, you could become their untimely meal. Those are some of the stories I've heard over the years from rangers who've worked out there at night, and those desert-dwelling rascals have put them on edge about going back out there again in the dark. It's one of those things that was frequently brought up around me, but there seems to be this unwritten rule that you didn't go too much into detail about what you knew. It drove people like me nuts. So, the next time I overheard one of the rangers talking about the things that lurked in the dark on the res, I pressed for more information. It was just him and me, so he thought that there wouldn't be any harm in letting me in on this very interesting story. He told me that he had become a park ranger out of desperation. It wasn't his kind of work at all, but it was the only thing that left that he had qualifications for, and he needed a job, like yesterday. So, things moved swiftly enough so that he was on board and out patrolling in a very short space of time. Now, at this time, you thought it was a blessing. It turned out that the state just had a hell of a time getting rangers to patrol that particular area at certain times, if you catch my drift. He had been out patrolling when he saw this man attacking a young girl. He looked like he had a knife and was very quickly getting the upper hand. The park ranger jumped out of his patrol car, drawing his sidearm. He shattered a warning shot, not expecting the man to really heed. The girl's attacker responded with lightning speed, leaping off of her, moving fast towards the ranger. If he had not pulled the trigger as soon as he did, he would have found himself in the same struggle that she had been. The man's movements were unnaturally fast. The man had flinched at the sound of the gunshot, turning his head to the side just enough so the bullet entered his eyeball, on the closest to the nose, exiting on the side closest to his ear. In other words, the man lost an eye, but nothing else. It was a wound that would have stopped anybody, but the man took off running into the wilderness. The woman, shaken up, but didn't have any life-threatening injuries. She spoke a language the ranger could not understand. He got her secured, taken care of, to make sure she was going to be okay. From that day forward, whenever the ranger was on patrol, he would encounter animals that only had one working eye. During night patrol, of course, the headlights would stab into the darkness, lighting up only one eye in the head of a wolf with a face full of malice. Elk and coyotes, and even the occasional bear, would throw him looks from a single working eye. It was all he could do to muster up the courage to go work each and every day, wondering if that would be the last day that his shape-shifting rival would strike. I still see him from time to time, so if the story is true, that thing, whatever it is, hasn't gotten him yet. You might not believe me, but I saw a strange shape-shifting creature one day at the park that I worked at as a ranger. At nighttime, around 7:30, I was sitting down writing in my journal when I looked up to see something weird coming in my direction over the hill. It appeared to be this oversized wolf. Now, I should have been terrified, and at first, I was just fascinated. It was the picture of a matured, wise old soul of the woods. He was massive and stately, and I couldn't help admiring him. The fear caught me when its legs lengthened and its ears grew longer and thicker until they became antlers. Right before my eyes, the wolf had transformed into a deer. I was stunned for several minutes before I could get the signal to run from my brain to my legs. I was sleep deprived that day, and I kept trying to explain it away with that. But I have also heard stories about skinwalkers. The explanation that they change a little bit each time. I'm stuck with the memory of seeing an actual transformation, which means that one of the explanations I've heard is true, and none of them are remotely pleasant. I'm one of those teenagers that really likes to party. My story takes me back to when I was 15, 3 years ago, in late October. Myself, my brother, and two other friends of ours were driving back home from a party here in the suburbs. It was raining pretty hard out, so we had to drive around 5 miles an hour. It's not often we got rain that limited visibility as badly as snow does. Most of us were in a love-hate relationship with the anxiety over the possibility of blindly striking a vehicle or being struck by one. I guess it was the closest thing to being forced into a game of chicken. We finally got into the parkway that surrounds the woods. Visibility was absolutely ridiculous, but fortunately, we were in my friend's SUV, so stopping on a dime wouldn't be a problem. I think all of us had a heart attack when something slammed into the side of the vehicle. It wasn't another car. It was a person. A girl who looked like she'd been out in the rain for days. It wasn't the sort of area that it was a good idea to pick up hitchhikers, but under the circumstances, we made an exception for this poor girl. She got into the back seat with me and my brother. Right away, I knew something was wrong. The most awful smell I'd ever smelt in my life filled the cab of the SUV. I would have thought that any length of time in the rain like that would have been a little bit like a stink, at least washing the stink off, if that makes sense. This wasn't just bad body odor. This stunk of rot, mold, and death. That was the very first time in my life that I had ever come close to vomiting, just by the smell of something. I also became aware of the sound of wheezing, the sort of sound you would expect to hear from somebody dying of pneumonia in a hospital bed. Somebody else must have been thinking the same thing. Our friend that was driving asked the girl if she needed to go to the hospital. She replied that she would just get off when we were closer to wherever we were going. Now, my friend warned her that where we were headed was pretty much in the middle of nowhere, but she assured us this was fine. I quietly thanked God that I had my brother between me and her, because I don't think I could have held the contents of my stomach if I were sitting right next to her. I nervously kept stealing glances at her. Her skin wasn't healthy. The circles around her eyes were so dark, I thought they were bruises. And the same sickly black and purplish color was also on her lips. The strangest thing happened after a few moments. I began to get a very, very hungry feeling. In spite of the awful stink that I was shacked up with, my stomach began rumbling. I was afraid that the bad smell would make me want to vomit, but instead, I only felt hungrier. As if things couldn't get any more bizarre, our friend that was driving suddenly let go of the wheel to attack our other friend in the passenger seat. My mind flashed through the events of the evening, looking for any trace of a reason why they would be upset with each other. But it was in the flash of lights of an oncoming car that I saw that the driver was using his teeth to bite. Our car was beginning to drift into the oncoming lane. So, as the fight in the front began to center over in the passenger seat, I made a mad grab for the steering wheel after I got my seatbelt off. The whole thing was just about as graceful as you would imagine. The car lurching off the road where it rolled several times, and miraculously enough, landed upright. My left elbow was screaming. I was pretty sure it was broken. I also think that I lost consciousness for several seconds. When I looked around, the only person in the SUV was me and my brother, yelling about something. Through blurred vision and clouded hearing, with the sound of the pouring rain beating against the twisted roof of the SUV, I saw the strange girl and our driver attacking our friend that had been in the passenger seat. He was trying to run away, and they were tracking him, tackling him down, clinging to him. My mind raced as to what I could possibly do. Directly behind me, in the furthest part of the SUV, was a tire iron. I only had one arm at that point, so I first opened my door, grabbing the tire iron, painfully negotiated my way out the SUV. The adrenaline and the agony of my broken elbow teamed up to make time feel like it was passing in slow motion. Well, for a few seconds, I had some doubts about what I was going to do. Those doubts evaporated when I could see the rain washing what looked like blood down this girl's face, as her jaw seemed locked on her friend. I brought the tire iron down on her. She didn't let go right away. I shook off the shock and I struck a second time, and a third, and a fourth. Like an overgrown tick, she finally let go when there wasn't much left of her head. When she disengaged, our driver disengaged as well. My brother must have gotten a hold of either his phone or mine, because an ambulance and police showed up just a few moments after. The investigation dragged on a lot longer than it should have. There was no evidence of our strange hitchhiker. There was all the evidence in the world of our driver attacking the passenger. But despite me and my brother telling the same story, our account was viewed with suspicion. I think the only reason we aren't in jail right now is because the story of the driver and the passenger didn't implicate us. The driver is not in prison, but he is in a mental health facility. I've tried to go to see him several times, but for some reason, he was not allowed to see anybody at all. When I asked how he's doing, I didn't get any kind of answer, neither good or bad. Now, I've told this story a few times, but I can only count on one hand just how many times I have. It usually involved alcohol. I lucked out a little bit, told the story in front of an associate who was also a very strong Native American. He told me about some creature called a Wendigo that's supposed to be more evil spirit than monster. He summarized that they probably weren't allowing my friend any visitors, that they would be in a state but defied explanation. They probably didn't want any media attention. It sounds like a bad plot to a horror movie, but if that's true, then I can't imagine what sort of condition my friend is in, or if he'll ever come out of it. I know this sounds incredibly far-fetched, but I don't know who else to turn to. I don't know who else to tell my story to, so I'm hoping it'll at least be read by you. Thank you. When I went camping years back, I saw the one thing that changed my mind about there being any kind of beauty or serenity in nature. I no longer see the trees, I see the shadows. I no longer hear the birds. I only hear the wolves and any sounds of snapping twigs. It was me and several friends. We chose to camp next to a creek. It would be the easiest way to find our way back to civilization. So we just followed the creek out until we found a satisfactory spot. And then, when we were done, we would follow it back. We had a pretty good fire going. It was at that level of intoxication where I was trying to make torches out of whatever I could find on the forest floor. I wasn't doing a bad job. I turned around to see a shape coming up out of the creek, and at first, I thought that one of my friends had slipped into the water, which would have been nuts considering how cold the night was. As this shape continued to emerge out of the water, I could then see the murky water pouring out of the holes in its chest, and its mouth hanging wide open. The skin of the cheeks being papery, stretched so thin, I thought they would tear. The body was like a very tall person's, but the head was like somebody tried to take a human head and sculpt it into a deer's. Long nose, jaws, and antlers. And the most horrible smell in the world wafted over to me. It was like breathing pure airborne disease. The thing began to lumber towards me, and I scrambled out of its way, got close to the fire. My words were slurred, and in my panic, I wasn't able to say much more than a mush. My friends looked at me like I was doing acid, and a ghoulish howl from the monster as it began to come within the edge of the light. I stopped jabbering and pointed. This close to my friends, it dwarfed all of us. standing at least a good 7 feet tall. I somehow found it within myself to take one of my redneck torches and begin waving it, the fire, in front of the monster's face. It swatted it at me like it was a mosquito, but it definitely did not like the fire. One of my friends got the hint, poured our lighter fluid on the ground by squeezing it into a jet. The flames carved a path to the monster's feet, and it danced to avoid them. But it was too late. The legs kindled surprisingly well, and the thing retreated. We could tell that we were living on borrowed time, so we grabbed our bare essentials and left. We eventually went back for the rest of our things, but it took us quite some time. This was a creature that completely terrified me. I was about 8 years old. My family had gone to North Florida for a vacation. We were staying in a small cabin that sat on Lake Seminole, and the surrounding area was all wilderness. It was pitch black outside, except for some light from the full moon overhead, when I heard a big thud on the front porch. I thought there might be an alligator on the porch or something. I was eager for a look, but none of the windows on the porch were just straight glass. They were all ornate and colored and carved into complicated geometric facets. A voice that sounded eerily like my mother's asked me to open the door. I was almost sure that my parents were in their bedroom for the night, but I was a kid and curious. I wasn't entirely stupid. I snuck out the back door, peeking around the corner of the front porch. I don't know how I managed to surpass my scream, but what I saw standing at the front door was not my mother. It wasn't even human. I looked, and it just seemed like time seemed to elude it. Its lipless mouth asked me if I was still there, and it said that Mommy didn't want to wait forever outside. It looked like a freshly exhumed mummy, minus the wrappings. It had black and broken antlers jutting out of its skull. The very sight of it made my heart stop. I ran back inside as quietly as I could, and in my terror, I thought it had picked up on my presence and began to pursue me. I guess I didn't know what I was in for. But I was inside before it could get me. I hid in my bedroom, ignoring the knocks that persisted. For some reason, my parents never answered. I stopped for gas in a little town in northern Canada. I could tell it was dinner time, and after dinner hours were fading into the evening hours. Just outside the gas station that I stopped, I witnessed a family who looked Western get out of a small sedan and begin to unpack their wares, like blankets, jackets, and other things. What caught my eye, but is probably not all that relevant, was their children did not look well nourished, a kind of dysfunctional family. Turning the attention back to myself, I then began to pan out and look at the gas station clerk, who was talking to the father, and upon looking further in the distance, I noticed a strange gray humanoid figure watching them beyond the trees, with what appeared to have large gray claws and pitted eyes, like its eyes were just large, black, and empty, with small burning pitch inside. I had to rub my eyes to make sure I wasn't just seeing things, but when I opened my eyes again, this thing was gone. But one thing I did notice, a feeling remained lingering. A feeling you could almost grasp. Something that's physically tangible. Like something was here. Something different was in the area that was not there before I had ever noticed this figure. The dad was still talking to the clerk when he stopped conversation, walked away, and turned to look at me. His eyes were almost the same, black and dead-looking. And in that moment, all of his children and his wife turned to look at me too. and their eyes all the same, black and dead looking. I got the creeps. To this day, I don't know if the humanoid figure that I saw in the trees had anything to do with this freak family. I don't know. But I didn't stay very long. Either did the family. The only possible correlation I could think of is that there are creatures called Wendigos, which are nasty spirits. Supposedly cannibalistic, but I'm not exactly sure what this has to do with seeing this family and this humanoid off in the trees. Maybe it's possible they had a part to play together, but I can't be too sure. And that's about the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. My brother is a nature photographer. He does it for a living, and so because of this, we usually end up going out to the wilderness area all over the country. One time, we went up to the Great Grand Wilderness of British Columbia, just for fun, not on a client mission. And one time, he went into a northwestern town near this one nature reserve. He said to me that he had a really creepy feeling when he visited the McBride Canyon grocery. Well, we had been adventuring through various towns in the area, and had decided to visit the McBride in the early spring of 1978. I can tell you it was a cloudy day when we got there, and the mountains of the reserve were visible from miles away. When you get off the highway, number 37 specifically, you drove into a very calm, very beautiful area. It was so special that you had to stop in towns along the highway just to get your groceries. It was an area that was meant to be passed through, but not really lived in. The town square of McBride had several nice motels, a good Army surplus sales store, and the famous McBride grocery store in the center. The name of the store was in large neon yellow-green letters, but were very dim, which made them stand out in the weather. The store itself was a treasure trove of creaky floors and unkept 90-year-old shelves that smelled like natural ice deposits and alder smoked meat. Besides that, the place had an inner sense of light and perception. Meanwhile, we got to the grocery store, and this is when the mood becomes strange. At some point, my brother was pulled aside and warned of his career, because a North American Indian legend demon, a Wendigo, was spotted on the outskirts of town just before the summer had started, and was most likely still lurking in the area. I guess a lot of people there have been talking about it, since it's been making itself known to all the residents. Fortunate enough for me, I stayed behind in the motel when this happened. I guess, long story short, my brother had ventured out, all by himself in the early morning hours, to a small hill just outside of town. He was trying to get some good shots of some deer that were coming to the small clearing where there's a large pond to drink. If you know anything about deers, they are nocturnal, and are very active during the dark. So he wanted to get there as soon as daylight appeared, just before light, so that they would still be drinking and not yet bedding down. But what he did not expect to see was this strange, monstrous creature, which he described to me was a Wendigo in the flesh. He described it as having horns, covered in hair, and having almost like a skeletal-like frame. Remember, this was back in the late 70s. Nothing like that even existed, as far as anybody was concerned. Not even in horror movies. My brother was so genuinely terrified. He changed careers and stopped as a nature photographer for years afterwards. He was far too scared to go back out into the wild. And even afterwards, he had a very hard time talking about it. In fact, he wouldn't mention it. He refused to even acknowledge the term Wendigo. But back then, that's not really something you would talk a lot about. But there were times where I would try to bring it up to him, to get him to talk about it. But That was the hard part. The only thing I've ever learned in all these years about Wendigos is what I've already told you, that they are murderous, Native American spirits, thirsty for flesh and blood, and will hunt down anybody they can. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, because I very well might be wrong about that, but they can also take several forms, from what I've heard of several local natives. Everything from these gaunt, disgusting skeletal figures to large, terrifying, hairy beasts, and everything in between. If there's anything you don't want to run into, and my brother was proof, is a Wendigo. I was out in the wilderness of California on a camping trip with my brother and a few mutual friends of ours. I can tell you the exact date and year it was. That's how much this terrifying event sticks out in my memory. It was October 22nd, 1980. My brother and I and our friends had pitched a huge tent for the night, and we were all sitting around the campfire, just talking about usual teenage stuff. I remember it was a very dark night, a cloudless sky. The moon was full, but the clouds had blocked out all the stars. There was no light from the moon, due to the thick clouds, so it was very dark. We had no choice but to keep the fire going. Suddenly, we heard a noise from the woods and see this large black shape moving through the forest. It slowly came to the light of the fire, and we see this very large, hulking figure. It appeared to be black and white. It had black eyes, but they seemed to kind of glow. It had very huge, long arms and legs, large black claws. The head appeared to be smaller, but had a very sharp, pointed nose, and it had long, tangled, brownish black hair. The hands and feet were also very large, like a human's, but with huge black claws. It stood at the edge of the campfire light, swaying back and forth as it watched us. We all sat there frozen as it watched us, making these strange noises. It was moaning, kind of in this deep growling voice. It was horrible. It sounded like cats dying. We all kept our eyes locked on it, not daring to make a move. It then emitted this terrible, horrible scream and began to move towards all of us. We jumped up, screaming and running for the tent. I reached it first. As I was going inside, I saw it better. It was now directly there, and I appeared to look into its eyes. Then it showed its teeth, and I was frozen. It opened its mouth, and I saw a massive row of long, pointed fangs, except every teeth were like that, and they were all in a very strange way. By staring into its eyes, I felt drawn to it, like my body was entranced. Then, I felt a hand on my shoulder and I turned and saw my brother. He pulled me away and stepped backwards. As I did so, it took another step forward. I saw that it was reaching out for me and breathing heavily. It made this horrible gurgling sound, and I saw its chest rise and fall as it was breathing. I gazed back at its mouth and saw that blood was now emitting from its mouth, all over and pouring down its chest. It began to back away, and my brother kept pulling me back. I couldn't help still feel like I was in a trance and being drawn to this thing that I was trying to shake off. I just felt myself wanting to go near it, like it was pulling me in. I felt in that moment the evil being broken over me, and just like that, from my brother pulling me back in the tent, I came out of a trance. After that, we all went running, abandoned everything, the tent, our equipment, everything, and just ran. We knew that as we ran, it was watching us. We were all very incredibly frightened by this experience, and especially in 1980, you couldn't tell anybody about this without being called a loon. So for the longest time, my brother and I just kept it to ourselves, unless we want to be called crazy by saying we saw some crazy monster in the woods. We wouldn't learn till much later that this creature we encountered was actually a Wendigo spirit that was probably looking to cannibalize us. I'm surprised I even managed to escape, because I know, just looking back on it, that it put me in some sort of dark trance and was going to consume my soul had I let it get too close to me. That would have been the end of me. I know for a fact there would have been nothing left. Probably not even bone. Why this thing began gurgling and emitted blood, I'm not exactly sure. Or why it even gave up on trying to grab me, who knows. But it was by far the most frightening experience you could ever imagine having out in the woods all by yourself. Especially growing up, and you're taught that the woods are a safe place. Monsters aren't supposed to exist. And yet here we are, 2021, and there are countless stories upon stories upon stories of people seeing all sorts of horrible things, just like I did, out in the woods, when they trusted their peers, their parents, their families, that life, the woods, and everything like that is safe. I'm telling you right now, that notion could not be farther from the truth. I've stayed out of the woods and have pretty much refrained from any camping since that day 40 plus years ago. No, I'm not losing out. I'm staying safe. This was years ago, back when me and a group of close friends were all about 17 to 19. Some of us drove and others did not. To add some quick background, I've never experienced something like this before, and typically did not believe in the paranormal. I haven't experienced anything strange in the woods since, and I've continued to hunt and track and spend time outdoors. I have no explanation for the events that would occur on this night. On an August evening, a group of friends and I were sleeping in a small cabin out in the woods. The cabin was very old and run down, but was the only shelter from the weather. The cabin was actually owned by my best friend's father, who had the place for years and years, but was too lazy to do the proper upkeeping on it. Sure, it did the job, but it desperately needed some much love and TLC. The night started out like any other. We were sitting around the fire and telling stories. I can still remember the feeling of the fire. It was so warm and comforting. I thought nothing of it at the time, though. Anyway, we all go inside shortly thereafter, and around 9 p.m., the group of us went to bed. We were due to go scouting for good spots for deer stands the next day, and really wanted to get a good night of sleep. We were all very tired, so nobody was alarmed at the fact that we all went to sleep at the same time. After all, the drive up here was 3 hours, and I'm sure you know just how taxing long car rides can be mentally. Then, we didn't sleep so peacefully after that. 1 hour later, something had happened. I was awoken by a loud thud coming from the kitchen, followed by a scream. I immediately jumped from my bed and ran toward the kitchen. The rest of the group did the same as we were all awakened and terrified as what was now happening. Whatever this was. My best friend and his father were in the kitchen, and both of them looked like they were terrified, staring wildly out the door. Sometimes, my friend's father would drop early in the morning and crash out in the main room, so it wasn't a surprise to see him here. We all asked both of them what was wrong and why they were screaming. Soon after, we heard the sound of something coming from the roof. All of us in unison turn our attention to the roof, and we can hear something very large walking across the cabin roof. Then, it
Whatever it was let out this terrifying screech. And I remember the exact sound as it was like a howl screeching, only 10 times louder. The screech was so loud and piercing, it hurt my ears, and I remember I had to cover them with my hands because it was painstaking. The screech was also very deep in pitch and sounded like you took an owl and were choking the life out of it to get that noise. It was horrible. I can remember just looking at my friends and my friend's father, and we all had the same face of terror. Somebody says, "What the hell is that?" While somebody else asked, "Is that a Bigfoot?" Then, the screeching stopped and we heard this loud thud, dropping from the roof, hitting the ground on the side of the cabin. It sounded like whatever weighed about 500 pounds dropped to the ground. It was heavy. But the screech continued on for another minute, and then it was silent. I remember having to force myself to leave the safety of the kitchen and walk out into the main foyer. I remember the cold and the moonlight shining in through the windows of the cabin. I remember the cold feeling in my body. Picture this. Be inside the middle of a horror movie, and just try to imagine how that feels. I think I could speak for all of us when we were overcome with dread and fear. After it went completely silent, my friend's dad opens the front door and shines his light out to look, and you could hear the night outside was so quiet. There was no crickets, no noise, no nothing. And keep in mind, this was in late summer. The forest is usually pretty alive at night. Crickets and sounds of nightlife. It was incredibly eerie, and we all had this lingering feeling like something really bad was going to happen. One of our friends, maybe in a moment of craziness or what suggested we all go outside together to find the source of that noise. And when I think most of us screamed at him, "Are you crazy?" I mean, even my friend's dad had a very concerned look on his face. He kept pacing back and forth, just saying, "This isn't good. No, this isn't good." Trying his best to keep us calm and in the cabin. He told us we all need to wait it out until morning, and we're going to have to cancel our hunting trip. Or our deer stand hunting trip, I should say. I don't know if he was more scared than we were, but his reaction was to force us to stay in the cabin until morning light. One of the friends in the group, maybe the craziest of all of us, decided that he was going to bravely go outside and look around in the dark to try and find the source of that noise. Apparently, he was convinced that this was nonsense, and he was going to prove it. He had one of those high-lumen flashlights. I tried. We all tried. We begged him not to go, but he was having none of it. So he frantically runs out the cabin like a madman, thinking he's going to be the Indiana Jones and be a hero and prove to us that it was nothing. Well, less than 5 minutes, he comes running back in the cabin, slamming the door shut, and he's screaming and pale as a ghost. He keeps saying really fast, "There's something outside. It's so big and it's walking around. I saw it." And he's pale, more pale than you'll ever get if you're sick. My friend's dad tried to comfort him to the best of his ability and redirect him to one of the small rooms in the cabin to try and further calm him down. We just kept the door locked that night and did our best to sleep, while others thought it would be best to stay up and keep watch. The rest of the night wasn't as eventful, but me, among a couple others who decided to stay up, kept hearing something really big walking around the cabin out in the dark. We were all too terrified to even dare shine our flashlights out there at whatever it was walking around. It honestly reminded me of the film Jeepers Creepers, honestly. It crept me out. I have no idea how many other friends even managed to get any sleep, but somehow they pulled it off. My friend's dad was among us who stayed up all night and was with me to help keep watch and make sure that we were all safe. Now, as soon as about 5 a.m. hits and it was light enough, we all promptly grab our stuff and without much conversation at all, loaded up our car and off we went. We also woke the ones who were asleep, so don't worry, we didn't leave them behind. but we didn't want to waste any unnecessary time in that cabin more than we had to. This is where things get creepy, as if they aren't already. My friend's dad drove back in his car, and we drove and followed him. He told us that he would meet us all back at their house, since that's where we all met up the day before to load up and go. The 3 hours plus back seemed like a blur of time. Thoughts of the previous night would not stop replaying in my mind. We get back to the house, began unloading our stuff, getting ready to go into our separate vehicles, and so I start asking my friend's dad what he thinks it was. Was it a cougar? A Bigfoot? I mean, honestly, what did we experience last night? He seemed very hesitant to talk about it, but after some more prying, I got him to open up. He began telling us how he's ran into it before and he knows what it is. Then he asks us a very serious question, more serious than I have ever seen him in my life. Have you guys ever heard of a Wendigo? We had not. He explained to us further that it's some cannibalistic spirit that has taken the physical form and will stalk you if it finds you. One time, about 4 or 5 years ago, he was hunting up by the cabin, and he felt like he ventured a little too far to the west, where this thing's territory must have been, and claims that it followed him back to the same cabin where we were staying. It's like it had our scent and was waiting for us to come back to that cabin to show ourselves. Even just typing this out gives me the creeps. I can't stop reliving it. I'm not sure why it never tried to get into the cabin, but who knows? Maybe it would have stayed longer. Maybe it was looking for weak points. We're not sure. Who knows? Maybe is all I could ever ask. Anyway, believe me or not, that's what I experienced. It happened in May of 2008. I was camping in the Rocky Mountains of Alberta with my family and friends. There were about 20 of us in total in a place called Banff National Park. We were driven out of our campsite by some sort of animal. We suspect a bear, and we ended up in a place called Johnston Canyon. This was in the middle of the night, and there was a windstorm going on. The wind was howling, and it was raining, although lightly. There was some thunder and lightning on in the background, but not too much. My friend and I were sharing a tent, and at about 3 o'clock in the morning, we hear a noise that sounded like something walking around outside the tent. My friend told me to turn on my headlamp, so I did. I shone the light out of the tent, and I saw something moving around with the corner of my eye. I quickly turned my headlamp on it, and it startled and scared the living daylights out of me. It, whatever it was about 8 feet tall, covered from head to toe in long, black, matted, nasty hair. It had these hollow, empty eyes that kind of glowed a dull yellow, and they illuminated from the light of the headlamp. It was staring at me. I tried to scream, but this thing was so ugly. It had a face that stuck out like a deer or maybe a dog, and even kind of had small little horns protruding on top of its head. Not like full-blown antlers, like a 8 or 9 or 10 rack deer would have, but this was more like little horns that you'd see a male buck having, like a little one. The face resembles more of a rotting skull with bits of tissue falling off it. I wouldn't notice though until afterwards, but this horrible odor of rotting meat lingered around our campsite for hours after the event. Once I shined my light into its face, it quickly lifted up its arm as if to shield its face from any kind of light, and kind of faded off into the obscurity of the darkness of the night. Either that or I turned away out of sheer terror and began screaming. My friend and I both saw it, and my behavior woke up pretty much everybody else. And so they're screaming at me through their tents, "What's going on? What did you see? What's wrong?" I told them right then and there, "Guys, there's something walking around our campsite that isn't an animal, and it's not human." I don't know what it was, but it scared me badly. After this, the rain came down pretty heavily, and so now we all just stayed put in our tents. Many of us went back to sleep, but my friend decided that we should try and stay up. Maybe keep an eye out in case this thing comes back. I did not have a weapon on me. I know, stupid, right? But my friend kept a Colt 45 with him at all times. He was always, and still is, a firm believer that if you're going to be hiking or out in the wilderness, you need to carry a powerful weapon in case you run into a dangerous situation and desperately need it. It seemed like after that thing left, the rain and storm intensified, as if its mere presence angered the storm. At some point in the morning, I passed out from sheer exhaustion and woke up sometime in the early AM. I think I was the first one up, and so I woke everybody, explaining we need to move now and not stick around, in case whatever that thing was decides to come back. I'm glad my friend stuck up for me and convinced my family and friends that I saw something, and that it's also verifiable and was not just a mistaken identity. They were convinced I saw something, although not sure what. We loaded up, packed out of there as quickly as we could. Now, moving forward in time, a little bit, I kind of forgot about the whole event, until months later. This same family friend and I are sitting down over a beer, and he brings up that time we saw that thing camping. I immediately remembered and had flashbacks to it. It scared me to even think about. He explained to me, yeah, I tried to do some research on what I think we saw. I'm pretty sure it's no Bigfoot. Did not look or act like one. It had to have been a Wendigo. To further tie things in, I recently found your channel and was reminded of this event again by the same friend telling me I should reach out to you for verification. Is this a Wendigo we saw, or something else? Me and my brother were hunting back in the foothills of Ohio when we found ourselves in a rather large, small cave. Driven by curiosity, we were no seasoned spelunkers, nor did we have the proper equipment to safely explore deeper. But we didn't care. We were young, on a thrill ride mission. So, let me explain to you how the cave looked. We were on a steep incline down a bunch of rocks, down to this cave opening, which was very large, but kind of bled into a smaller tunnel, which is why I say it was a small, large cave. It had a strange smell emanating from the cave, and the further down we got, the more terror we could sense. As we neared the bottom of this steep incline, my brother points to me and says, "Look at this." And to my horror, all along the bottom, where there were no rocks and it was flat, there were dead birds, like everywhere, all in varying states of decay. Some freshly dead, some completely rotted and skeletal, while others were in the process somewhere in between of rotting. You can just imagine the smell was just lovely. As we're trying to put together the pieces, why are there so many dead birds down here? It doesn't look like anything killed them. It looks like they just fell out of the sky and died here. We get this really bad feeling, like something is watching us from inside this cave. We should not continue onward. So we immediately turn around and start making our way back up. And as we do, the feeling does not lessen. It gets stronger and stronger. And so now we're moving faster and faster. And we get up the incline and we don't dare look back until we get well out of the opening or the mouth of the cave. We get back up to the top of this incline, and we both sense something dangerous is down there. We can both know it, we both feel it, and we're spooked. We're experienced outdoorsmen and woodsmen, so we know our way around. We're not amateurs, but we felt and know something was watching us. We should have never went down there. We turn around to look back into the cave, and as we do, this enormous, hulking shadow appears in the opening. We both say to each other at the same time, "What the hell is that?" As we watched in amazement, this humanoid shadow seemed to stretch and grow, its arms and head reaching out. Then it stops. It stands still at the opening, its body still hidden in the darkness. It's completely motionless and silent. We feel its body watching us. Then it starts to make a sound. It's a haunting, long, deep howl. It's guttural and coarse, and it carries deep into the air. It's a low moaning growl like a wild animal would make, and it gets louder and louder until it's louder than our own voices, just like we were talking. It's so loud now that it's echoing off the mountainside, bouncing across the hills. It's the most terrifying howl I've ever heard. It's like a wailing howl of pure desperation and hunger. There's something about it that's just so compelling and so very wrong. I can't even begin to describe how it sounded. It's something you have to hear for yourself. As it's echoing out this horrendous howl, me and my brother don't need any more time to decide that we need to get as far away from here as humanly possible. Let's just say we cut our day short, and we still talk about that day even now. It was hands down the scariest thing I've ever dealt with while in the thick of the woods. This was just last summer, in 2020. One summer night, my friend and I are sitting around a bonfire with other friends and noticed a strange, pale, and gaunt figure staring at us through the trees beyond. We didn't think much of it, as it looked somewhat human. We assumed it was some kid or young adult who perhaps had been drinking and stumbled into our campground. We ignored the figure for a while, but it kept staring at us. It was not particularly tall, but was very thin. It was wearing what appeared to be a torn, dark brown robe, and it had pale white skin with very long, dirty, stringy black hair hanging from its face. It had no facial features that we could see at the distance. At least, that may not stand out as alarming, as I'm probably making it sound. But that was at first. After a while, the figure disappeared from the trees, and my friend and I, since we were the closest to the woodline, could hear something moving quickly in the woods coming in our direction. This made us both incredibly uneasy, as it would anybody. Quick note. This is where I have to insert a disclaimer that I'm not suggesting that what I saw was a Wendigo in fact. Also, I'm not trying to make a mockery of the idea of the Wendigo either. I merely want to share my own experience. I realize there's a lot of controversy surrounding the idea of Wendigos. If you don't believe in them, that's perfectly fine. I'm not trying to change anyone's mind. Just share my story and be done with it. I have to tell you, this is the point in the story where I begin to question my own sanity. The next thing we knew, we can hear it behind us, and we both turn, and all of us around the bonfire now see this thing in full. The figure had appeared, and it was now very tall, at least 8 feet. Its hair was longer than we thought, very long, and it had very sunken-in features, emaciated and sickly looking. It clearly was not human, at least any that I'd ever seen, and it just stood there at the tree line, observing, watching. Several of us began screaming, running back towards the camp, while the others of us were downright frozen where we were standing. I do not know what my friend and I were doing. We were stuck in a state of perpetual shock. I remember turning and running, and being so afraid that I was going to fall and this thing was going to grab me. I did not see or feel anyone behind me, but I only made it as far as the fire pit, and I stopped and turned to see what it was doing. It, to my horror, had begun running towards me, and was now very much taller and larger than I ever thought. It had singled me out and was charging me. I remember looking up at it when it was no more than a few feet away, and in that exact moment, it looked at me with these lifeless eyes. And somehow, I don't know, like some sort of paranormal phenomenon, its face had contorted and changed. It had no face. It was just a black void with eyes. I can't even begin to explain. I screamed and fell to the ground. I think my friend was screaming too, but it's a blur, to be honest. I don't remember. The next thing I do remember, I was sitting on the ground looking at my own hands covered in dirt and blood. When I look up, I was surprised to see my friend next to me, and he's looking around like crazy, trying to get me to go now before this thing comes back. I think I must have blacked out for a moment or two because It's like my brain just lapsed that moment of time completely out of my memory. Just like a voided check. We were all 15 or 16 at the time, so we make it back to camp. Everybody's freaking out, crying, telling our parents what we had seen. They listened and tried their best calming everybody down, trying to prove there's nothing spooky out in the woods. We have no reason to fear, and probably just saw a deer. But I tried convincing them, or at least I tried, that there was something there. We all saw it, and there's no denying that. They weren't really buying it, so I just gave up after a while and kept it to myself. I know it might sound very strange, and I want you to bear with me through these feelings, but I strongly feel that whatever I saw that night somehow attached itself to me, or marked me in some way. I don't know how to explain or describe my feelings. It's like it marked me. I feel different. Not just about my sighting, but I physically feel different. Like this thing is a part of me now. I haven't felt right ever since this happened, and I don't know who I can talk to about it, to be honest. My parents and family don't want to hear about it. And my friends listen to me, but there's not much they can do. Understandably so. What do you think happened? Can you provide me with some answers? Thank you.